Take one frog in cold water, add boiling water, and the frog jumps out. However, if you heat the water very slowly, the frog will just sit there. And sit there. And sit there.
Previously, in Hillary's America,
we've got to push from the outside.
Unless we take over the government.
In America, we called it progressivism. Soviet Union, they called it communism. In Italy, they called it fascism.
Now, one of the very important strands of modern progressivism, the idea of eugenics. Obamacare, the typical Alinskyite scam. The real point of the scheme? To enable the federal government to take over the healthcare industry.
So let's leave the movie for a second and get back to where Dinesh left off in American history, in 1964, because the story happens to get much more interesting there. In 1964, the Republican Party was in a civil war.
Precisely 1 year ago today, on July 14th, 1963, I warned that the Republican Party is in real danger of subversion by a radical, well-financed, highly disciplined majority.
Segregationists, angry that the party wouldn't commit to rolling back civil rights, had already joined forces with paranoid McCarthyists, who were similarly convinced that the whole civil rights brouhaha was just the result of communist subversion.
In the past hour, we have offered only a brief survey of the material that's available to support the charge that the civil rights movement, as we know it today, is simply part of a worldwide movement organized and directed by communists to enslave all mankind.
Together, they had worked on a campaign to impeach Earl Warren. But now, some of the libertarian businessmen who were frustrated with the Republicans' unwillingness to roll back the New Deal started to bankroll them. This far-right coalition won at the convention. They elected Barry Goldwater to be president, a man who had voted against civil rights not because he was racist, he promised, but because it violated people's economic liberty. This takeover completely alienated blacks from the party. You'll recall this from Hillary's America.
Tens of thousands of Klansmen marched on New York City shouting racist slogans and burning crosses to celebrate the Democratic Party's refusal to condemn the KKK in their platform.
At the 1964 Republican Convention, Nelson Rockefeller had proposed an amendment condemning the KKK. He was booed and shouted down. What happened next is best described by baseball legend Jackie Robinson, who was at the convention as the delegate for Rockefeller. From his autobiography.
Early in 1964, I wrote a speaking out piece for the Saturday Evening Post. A Barry Goldwater victory would ensure that the GOP would become completely the white man's party. What happened at San Francisco when Senator Goldwater became the Republican standard bearer confirmed my prediction. I wasn't altogether caught off guard by the victory of the reactionary forces in the Republican Party, but I was appalled by the tactics they used to stifle their liberal opposition. That convention was one of the most unforgettable and frightening experiences of my life. The hatred I saw was unique to me because it was hatred directed against the white man. It embodied a revulsion for all he stood for, including his enlightened attitude toward black people. I will never forget the fantastic scene of Governor Rockefeller's ordeal as he endured what must have been 3 minutes of hysterical abuse and booing, which interrupted his fighting statement, which the convention managers had managed to delay until the wee hours of the morning. It was a terrible hour for the relatively few black delegates who were present. Identified with the cause of republicanism, they had been served notice that the party they had fought for considered them just another bunch of niggers. They had no real standing in the convention, no clout. They were unimportant and ignored.
Thankfully, the Republicans were steamrolled in the general election. For now, civil rights were safe. But in 1968, the tables had turned. The Democratic Party was now at war with itself.
What are you trying to strong-arm stuff? He's an elected delegate.
Chicago police are now in the aisles here with billy clubs, clearing people out.
This surely is the first time that policemen have ever entered the floor of a convention.
In the United States.
This created a huge opportunity for whoever was best poised to win the Republican nomination in 1968, and there was no question who that would be.
Sock it to me?
Richard Nixon. But Nixon needed to fend off an insurgent campaign from the new governor of California, Ronald Reagan. Reagan had responded to Martin Luther King's assassination earlier in the year by condemning not the assassin, but Martin Luther King himself. So, unlike Nixon, segregationists knew where he stood. This meant Nixon was vulnerable in the South, and so he made a deal with South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond. He couldn't appoint judges who would overturn Brown, and he couldn't very well violate court orders. But Nixon could elect judges that would, quote-unquote, protect states' rights against federal encroachment, which in turn would make Brown versus Board effectively unenforceable. In exchange, Thurmond would endorse Nixon in the primary. Nixon got his majority, and Thurmond got his Supreme Court justices, after running an elaborate smear campaign against Johnson's pick for the court, Abe Fortas.
I am strongly opposed to turning loose criminals on technicalities. I am strongly opposed to communists working in defense plants. I am strongly opposed to communist teaching in schools and colleges. I am strongly opposed to the Supreme Court, the federal government invading the rights of the states. And Justice Fortas has participated in decisions that do the very things I've just mentioned.
The vacancy was left to Nixon to fill. Nixon kept his promise. In 1974, the Supreme Court set the arbitrary limitation that schools couldn't be integrated across county lines. This meant all whites had to do was move to one side of an imaginary line, and they could go back to having all-white schools. And through a combination of affordability, under-the-table discrimination in home financing, and outright violent intimidation, blacks wouldn't be able to follow. Schools today are now more racially segregated than they were in the 60s. But the real carnage didn't come until the 80s. In 1980, Ronald Reagan launched his 1980 presidential campaign in Neshoba County, the site of one of the civil rights era's most brutal political murders. His announcement speech contained an interesting few lines.
I believe there are programs like that, programs like education, others that should be turned back to the states and the local communities with the tax sources to fund them. I believe in states' rights. I believe in people doing as much as they can for themselves at the community level and the private level. And I believe that we've distorted the balance of our government today by giving powers that were never intended in the Constitution to that federal establishment.
Now, the normal narrative about this is that this was a dog whistle. A dog whistle is supposedly when a politician says something that acts as code that lets racists know that that politician agrees with them, but non-racists will just hear it and think of something benign. In other YouTube videos about Dinesh and this whole the parties never flip theory, you'll often hear this combined with a famous quote from notorious Republican strategist Lee Atwater.
You start out in 1954 by saying by 1968 you can't say that hurts you, backfires.
So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. You're getting so abstract now that you're talking about cutting taxes and all these things. You're talking about totally economic things, and a byproduct of them is that blacks get hurt worse than whites.
And subconsciously, maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if it gets more abstract and that coded, that we are doing away with the racial problem one way or another.
You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying, we want to cut this is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than...
But I'm going to diverge from the normal narrative here. I've never really liked the term dog whistle, and I've never really thought it was a good idea to take anything Lee Atwater had to say at face value. States' rights is not a dog whistle. States' rights has been the term Southern politicians have used to defend their racial caste system for almost 200 years. From Calhoun to Alexander Stevens to Strom Thurmond, dog whistle implies that there was a class of person who didn't understand what was being promised here. Everybody understood what he meant. For that matter, everybody understood what Reagan meant when he referred to young bucks or welfare queens. Everyone got it, and everyone knew. How can that be a dog whistle? It's not. It's just the bare minimum of plausible deniability. When Reagan went to Mississippi to tap dance on Andrew Goodman's grave and promised the locals to protect them from further Yankee incursions, he wasn't implying anything. He was making an explicit promise to appoint judges that would render the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act unenforceable. And that's what he did. Between the mid-70s and now, most of the civil rights legislation written in the 60s was modified in ways that might seem small and technical, but in practice blew huge loopholes in the laws that rendered them effectively worthless. The Justice Department stopped enforcing the VRA on redistricting plans by pretending racial gerrymanders were just political.
I want to recap. Yesterday, you indicated to me, and your testimony previously has indicated, that you believe that the governor's decision, Governor Treen's decision to announce he would veto the Nunes plan was based on a political consideration. It was not racially motivated, it was politically motivated. Is that correct?
That's correct. We went through an extensive analysis. We probed the mindset of the legislatures. We looked at the entire redistricting situation. At the conclusion of our full examination of the Louisiana redistricting, we were able to conclude, I was able to conclude, that it was not something that had been motivated by the racial animus or by racial purpose.
In a confidential portions of your staff memo, they brought to your attention the allegation that important legislators in defeating the Nunes plan in the basement said, quote, "We already have a nigger mayor and we don't need any more nigger big shots." And the court cited evidence of discriminatory intent on the part of other legislators, including the representative who testified at the court hearing, that there were legislators, quote, who don't feel they wanted to have a district that would be able to elect a black representative. To me, it seems to me that it's awful clear.
The EEOC, now headed by, oh no. We'll get back to him. The EEOC simply refused to pursue any class action discrimination suits under the Reagan administration. The last vestiges of busing were eliminated. Instead of filing cases against people discriminating against minorities, the Justice Department filed cases against state and local governments for doing too much, something the Civil Rights Division clearly wasn't supposed to be doing. Fortunately, the Senate has oversight over who gets to run that division. Unfortunately, this is who the Republicans had in charge of the Senate Judiciary Committee.
I regret starting a few minutes delayed, but I just got back from the White House. I hope it didn't inconvenience anyone.
This piecemeal, under-the-table approach to dismantling civil rights had another benefit for the right. It meant they could campaign against things that weren't happening anymore.
You needed that job, and you were the best qualified, but they had to give it to a minority because of a racial quota. Is that really fair? You'll vote on this issue next Tuesday. For racial quotas, Harvey Gantt. Against racial quotas, Jesse Helms.
By the time this ad came out in 1988, the only affirmative action allowed was voluntary efforts from private companies. For governments, it was already illegal, and it was never required of private companies. By the way, this was a campaign ad for Jesse Helms, an unreconstructed segregationist Republican. Then there are the judges. In 1987, Reagan appointed Antonin Scalia to the court and replaced the moderately conservative Chief Justice Warren Burger with William Rehnquist, who, unbeknownst to the Senate at the time, because it was covered up, had written a briefing arguing Plessy v. Ferguson was correct and that Brown v. Board of Education should be ruled in favor of the segregationists. When this did get out, of course, it was already too late. Thank God for lifetime appointments. In 1989, the Supreme Court, now run by William Rehnquist, gutted the Equal Employment Clause of the Civil Rights Act. Bosses were allowed to engage in racist harassment, and the burden of proof for explicit discriminatory intent was moved to the plaintiff. This meant essentially in order to win a discrimination lawsuit, your boss would have to have been dumb enough to admit to doing it for racist reasons on tape. Congress tried to push back with a new civil rights bill, but this was vetoed by George Bush, and a weakened version of the bill was written instead. In 1991, Bush appointed Clarence Thomas to the court to replace civil rights icon Thurgood Marshall. Thomas's extreme anti-civil rights views were unfortunately given cover by his skin color, and overshadowed by his personal conduct as a boss.
After a brief discussion of work, he would turn the conversation to a discussion of sexual matters. His conversations were very vivid. He spoke about acts that he had seen in pornographic films involving such matters as women having sex with animals and films showing group sex or rape scenes.
He squeezed through with 52 votes. In 2008, the Supreme Court was now run by John Roberts, who started as a clerk for the pro-Plessy Rehnquist and then worked in the Reagan administration undermining voting rights law for the Justice Department. With its new hard-right majority, the Supreme Court allowed states to both demand state picture IDs in order to vote and charge as much as they wanted in fees or inconvenience to get an ID. Several states would coincidentally close down most branches of the DMV in majority black districts after passing such laws.
Voter ID, which is going to allow Governor Romney to win the state of Pennsylvania. Done.
In 2007, Roberts simply gave up the local control game altogether. In Parents Involved v. Seattle, the court simply ruled that any plan for racial integration was a violation of the 14th Amendment. The right of the federal government to regulate how states alter voting laws to prevent disparate impacts on non-white communities was taken away, on the basis of a doctrine called equality between the states, a doctrine which appears to have been invented by John Roberts himself out of whole cloth. And with that, the 1965 Voting Rights Act was essentially repealed by judicial fiat. And it won't stop there. You've probably seen lots of conservatives complaining about bakers being forced to make wedding cakes for gay couples. This whining isn't just a way for conservatives to pretend they're persecuted. It's setting the stage for a lawsuit that will go to the Supreme Court. And when that court rules that laws against gay discrimination must have a religious exemption, that won't just apply to gays or to wedding cakes. It will apply to anyone who says their religion requires them not to interact with other genders or other races. In other words, the 1964 Civil Rights Act will be entirely defanged. Am I saying Dinesh D'Souza, despite making a movie arguing that the Civil Rights Act is a great Republican accomplishment, actually secretly hates it and thinks it should be repealed? No, because it's not a secret.
Am I calling for a repeal of the Civil Rights Act of 1964? Actually, yes.
Dinesh D'Souza grew up Catholic and the son of a millionaire in a country that was nominally Hindu and socialist, and he hated it. He denigrates India constantly in his work.
It's like my home country of India. There the whole country is controlled by gangs, street gangs, political gangs. They own you. That's why I left India.
When he came to Reagan's America, he found a country that venerated the rich and Jesus Christ in that order. He loves that America, the America of hierarchy and cultural chauvinism. And he hates the Democrats for, in his eyes, ruining it.
So how will you know when you have become an American? You'll know when you become a Republican.
Any questioning the role inheritance or racial discrimination or bias policing plays in black poverty threatens that hierarchy, and thus, in his eyes, America itself. But let's be clear. Poor people aren't poor because they commit crimes or because they don't have stable families or because they produce nothing of value for society. After all of those things are true about Dinesh D'Souza, and he's a millionaire. And honestly, I don't even think Dinesh D'Souza believes this. The End of Racism doesn't really have a thesis because as a book, it's not really making an argument. It's making a threat. Embrace conservative policy goals and stop talking about racial disparity. And us rightists will abide by your polite fiction that whites are equal to blacks. Push for government intervention to alleviate black poverty. And well, it's only natural that people will gravitate towards less polite voices. So what are those policy goals? Aside from repealing the Civil Rights Act, of course. Dinesh provides 6, but I want to focus on the first 2.
We hear many new proposals for how to address such glaring social problems as crime and dependency on the government. One proposal is for criminals to pay mandatory restitution to those they have wronged. If they lack the resources, they should be required to do physical labor. A second proposal is to hold parents partly responsible for the crimes of their minor-age children.
So in other words, fine people who haven't committed crimes, and if they can't pay those fines, which seems likely given the median net worth of a black household, sentence these innocent people to do hard labor for no pay. Otherwise known as
50 lashes.
Dinesh spends a lot of time in his movie trying to convince the viewer that Planned Parenthood is secretly trying to prevent black people from reproducing. Do you think maybe his real criticism is that their methods aren't effective enough? Anyway, the other 4 rules.
A third is to limit welfare benefits for mothers who continue to have children while on welfare. A fourth is to insist that teenage welfare mothers take up education, training, or work. A fifth is to strengthen paternity and child support laws. A sixth is to modify the tax code to strengthen rather than penalize two-parent families.
So, fun fact, liberals did surrender to this threat. All 4 of these rules were signed into law by Bill Clinton.
And even though the bill has serious flaws that are unrelated to welfare reform, I believe we have a duty to seize the opportunity it gives us to end welfare as we know it.
But here's Dinesh, 25 years later, still moving the goalposts. At this point, the movie has given up narrative in order to turn into an anti-Hillary attack ad.
To scrupulously respect the neutrality of the Cambodian
that's real smart.
A dangerously libelous attack ad, honestly.
And if her husband's a sex abuser, how's that her fault? Actually, it is. In many ways, she orchestrated all of this. Hillary knew early on that Bill could easily cross the line into sex abuse. At first she got mad, then she figured out she could use his addiction to make him dependent on her.
This is followed by 2 consecutive musical montages, consisting entirely of cheap stock footage of vaguely patriotic imagery. When a movie ends with a wet fart, it's hard for a review of that movie to not end likewise. So, I'll end with one last observation. Dinesh D'Souza is a monster, obviously, but like I said, he's right that the normal liberal history of the switch is wrong. The Republicans don't use dog whistles. You just heard yourselves Dinesh explicitly call for putting innocent black people into debt slavery as a means of civilizing the black race. And for it, he was rewarded with millions of dollars and attaboys from the leading public intellectuals of the Republican Party. Because he was one of the more moderate voices. We accused the Republicans of using the Southern strategy, but why? What was Southern about it? Nixon didn't just win the South in 1972, he won everything. And Reagan didn't just win the South either, he won everything. And as we've previously established, suburban white people in the North understood perfectly well what states' rights meant, and they were not disgusted by what they heard. And I'm amazed I need to say this, but Lee Atwater is not telling the truth here. There was no golden age of honest, obvious racists that were very easy to identify. Look, here's George Wallace's famous Segregation Forever speech. Tell me if this doesn't sound familiar.
We are faced with an idea that if a centralized government assumes enough authority, enough power to dictate, to forbid, to require, to demand, to distribute, to edict, and to judge what is best, and enforce that judgment upon us, its citizens from unimpeachable authority, that it will produce only good. It is a government that claims to us that it is bountiful as it buys its power from us with the fruits from its appropriation of the wealth that free men before it have produced, and builds on crumbling credit without responsibility to the debtors of our children. It is an ideology of government erected on the encouragement of fear and fails to recognize the basic law of our fathers, that governments do not produce wealth, people produce wealth, free people. But the strong, simple faith and sane reasoning of our founding fathers has long since been forgotten, as the so-called progressives and liberals tell us that our Constitution was written for horse and buggy days. So were the 10 Commandments.
The most famous pro-segregation speech in American history, and it's the same damn small government platitudes we get today. Now, here's the Republican nominee for governor of Louisiana in 1992.
One reason why the welfare system is out of control is because we have a massive illegitimate welfare birth rate in this country. I mean, they're literally breeding faster than they can raise your taxes to pay for them all.
For those of you who don't recognize the name, this is David Duke, the most famous Klansman of the modern era. He successfully won a Republican primary to be governor of Louisiana. and he won the majority of the white vote. I guess it kind of throws a wrench into the whole narrative, doesn't it? Republicans are the party of Lincoln, and they always have been, except for that weird, brief interlude where David Duke was a standard bearer for the party in the governor's race, and Strom Thurmond had final say on who got to run the Civil Rights Office of the Justice Department. And the most popular book in the conservative movement was a book that used race science to advocate for a return to eugenics, and I, Dinesh D'Souza, personally advocated we repeal the Civil Rights Act. But, aside from that, so no dog whistles, no Southern strategy, not even really a switch, so much as a realignment from north and south to urban and rural. So why do liberals and leftists tell ourselves this story? In Hillary's America, Dinesh dishonestly quotes from this book called The Myth of Southern Exceptionalism.
Blacks and whites both switched parties for economic reasons. Proof of this is in Byron Schaeffer and Richard Johnston's book, The End of Southern Exceptionalism. The authors provide data to show that the poorest, most racist whites never switched. The ones that did switch were the non-racists.
The actual thesis of that book is this. De jure segregation ended at the expense of most northern and western whites thinking and acting like southern whites. It was a diffusion of racist politics across the country rather than a weakening of it in one region. No one's trying to uphold de jure segregation anymore, but everyone from every corner of the country is trying to uphold de facto segregation.
The Little Rock school desegregation showdown in 1957, which everybody's heard about, where Orville Faubus called out, and they stopped black students from going to school. And 2 months earlier, there was a riot in Levittown, Pennsylvania, one of the all-white suburbs built after World War II with federal assistance. And a black family moved in, the first black family to move into any of the Levittowns. And the white neighbors threw rocks, and there was a mob, and the National Guard had to come out in Pennsylvania. And we asked, why do we not remember Levittown? Because you can tell the story of Little Rock as a morality play in which the end is the triumph of a liberal national idea. And if you ask the story of Levittown, and you have to say, what's the consequence of that? It's not the Brown decision finally being enforced in Arkansas. It's the continued issues that we have in our country with housing segregation. The Levittown story leads to questions about why did the cities explode in the 1960s? It leads to questions about how the white backlash against the civil rights movement was fully national and always was, not just regional. And it's much harder to tell the story of, say, housing discrimination in the North or the West as a morality play that builds into the idea of the United States as having overcome the problems of the civil rights era and become a colorblind, country.
And so civil rights failed. For the same reason the first attempt at Reconstruction failed. Because the Supreme Court decided to write it out of the law. And because it's a democracy and there was never enough genuine white support to maintain a pro-civil rights electoral majority, except in name only. And that story implicates a lot more people than we would like to admit. My point isn't nothing's changed. The culture's changed, particularly in the South, which is important, but the law really hasn't. Except to say that if you want to discriminate, you can, so long as you don't leave a signed memo saying you're doing it because of race. And amazingly, these institutions regularly fail to meet even this basic standard of OPSEC. But this refusal to face up to the failure to protect civil rights from the Republicans has another hidden cost. The assumption undergirding the end of racism and the bell curve, and all the collected works of a million other C-list alt-right celebs is this. Minorities have all these benefits showered upon them by the far-left government, and yet they still fail. Maybe we need to be harder, crueler. Maybe that'll fix them. Maybe that'll finally solve the problem of black crime.
The laws are so horrendously stacked against us because for years and years they've been made to protect the criminal. Totally made to protect the criminal. Not the officers. You do something wrong, you're in more jeopardy than they are. And when you see these thugs being thrown into the back of a paddy wagon, you just see them thrown in, rough. I said, please don't be too nice. Like when you guys put somebody in the car and you're protecting their head, the way you put their hand over. Like, don't hit their head and they've just killed somebody, don't hit their head. I said, you can take the hand away, okay?
And white viewers believed them because who's telling them otherwise? People might talk about police brutality, but no one wants to own up to the fact that no one bothered to ring the alarm bell when it turned out the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court thought Brown v. Board was decided wrong, or how we completely surrendered to the right on affirmative action, school integration, and housing discrimination, or how, while whites got more and more resentful about protections minorities lost decades ago, or privileges they never even had to begin with, we let the whole enforcement apparatus of the Civil Rights Act get chipped away, bit by bit by bit, until, well...
If you heat the water very slowly, the frog will just sit there. And sit there. All the way to 100 degrees centigrade. Of course, we're a lot smarter than frogs, aren't we?
Before I start here, I just want to shout out my source because it's like one of my favorite books in the world. This is Nixonland by Rick Perlstein. On paper, it's just the history of Richard Nixon's political career from the 50s to 1972. But really, it's more the story of how America became America as we know it. And like really, if there's one book you want to read to understand American politics, this would be the one. And with the way the far right is gaining in European politics thanks to immigration, I suspect it also would make for a good practical guide for what to expect in the future of Europe. And I'd like to thank my patrons: Ted Teddington Tedsville, Spoderman, Farty Barfslab, The Anno, Diana Banana, Kitten of the Yarn Persuasion, The Snarky Lesbian, Jonas Sorensen, and the Goddess of My Idolatry, Kim Berry.